Well, welcome to our April History Talks. My name is Felicia Rova-Cameron. I'm the Associate Curator for the Lacey Museum. I am joined by Museum Assistant Olivia Moore, who will be moderating the virtual part of the presentation at the back of the room. Joining us for tonight's program is author and journalist Becky Garrison, who will be tracing the history of the barrel and bottle from early settlement to the modern craft distilling boom in our state of Washington. For those of you here in person, if you haven't already, we'd really appreciate if you would sign in after the conclusion of tonight's program, as this helps us get an accurate count of attendance. You can also use that form to sign up for our newsletter, and we will keep you posted about current updates. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and some museum news. The Lacey Museum is on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Squaxin Island Tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized today who were absorbed or relocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who are still here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as the traditional stewards of this land since time immemorial, and their role today in taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of dispossession, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as they have today. We recommend that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. So, as many of you know, we are moving. We are still working on getting our museum space ready over at the Belltown Center on 6th Avenue. We don't have an official date. However, I can say that things are progressing. So take my word for it. So we'll have some updated exhibits. Our current exhibits will be updated, and we'll have some temporary exhibits coming in as well. More information will be available soon. As we've mentioned before, the existing museum location at the Russell House will still exist. This will operate instead as a dedicated research center. We hope you'll join us next month for our last history talk of this season. Educator and historian James Akita will present a narrative of Asian American history that goes beyond the traditional story of Asian immigrants overcoming discrimination and assimilating into the United States. This talk will focus on the larger context which shaped the flows of Asian migrants to the U.S. in the first place, context defined in large part by the history of empire. Akita hopes to reframe Asian American history to shed light on the present and the future of Asian America. Moving on to tonight's presentation, we will hold our Q&A session at the end, and we'll do our best to get questions from our in-person and online audience. For those online, if you have any questions for Becky during the presentation, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box. This is usually located at the bottom of your screen. And for those in person, please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone over to take your question. Now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Becky Garrison. Becky Garrison is a satirist and storyteller. Since moving to the Pacific Northwest in 2014, she has been covering the Pacific Northwest craft culture, including food, beer, wine, spirits, cider, coffee, and cannabis CBD, as well as regional festival scene and the rise of secular spiritual communities. Thank you, Becky, for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Well, thanks, y'all. Before I get started, the reason why I wrote this book is simply, I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but Washington State is leading the nation in terms of the number of distilleries. New York is first, California, then it's a tie between Texas and Washington State. As one distillery closes, another one opens, but those numbers are pretty simple. However, there has never been a book written about the history of distilling. So I said, it's time to rectify that, and so I did. Now, first, before we get started, because no one had ever written this, I had to do a lot of original research, starting, Library of Congress and playing with all the different things. I began to start reading a bunch of books. I wanted to figure out, whenever they were discussing Washington State, just how drunk were we as a nation? Before we're heading out, was this just all of a sudden everybody went out west and got knackered, or was it a case of just what was the culture like before these people were moving out? So in that sense, this is a picture that's a fairly well-known. It's at the Pike Microbrewery Museum. If you haven't been to the museum, it's like it chronicles the 6,000 history year of beer while you're also drinking beer. It's a wonderful exhibit. And what I discovered in my research is that one of the reasons the Pilgrims had to land at Plymouth Rock in 1620 is because they ran out of beer. And this is a pretty big deal. The water was not fit to drink. So men, women, even children would drink 1 to 3% ABV beer. You had to, otherwise you would get sick and probably die. But there was also this beginning of what we call a class division. The people that had the money, not the Pilgrims, but the people that came after them, would bring their refined linen, their refined drinks, their refined spirits. Everyone else ended up making what they had to do, starting from the beginning. See, the land was primarily rural, and farmers often would produce a surplus of grain and fruits. There was no pasteurization, no refrigeration. So drying your food or distilling it was a viable and delectable way to preserve your products from rotting. And in part of that, George Washington, believe it or not, was one of our first distillers, as well as being our first president. His distillery, opened in 1799, produced about 10,500 gallons of rye, along with a few hundred gallons of peach and apple brandy. And here we have a picture. This is his actual distillery. They've actually reconstructed it. The reason why the picture is so dark is there's no electricity in there. They make this exactly the way that they made it in colonial days. Compare that to Copperworks Distilling Company in Seattle, one of the most modern, up-to-date. This is a still from Forsyths in Scotland, very high-end, very elite. But you'll notice the basic technique of how you make distilling really hasn't changed that much. So now, you might want to ask, why am I discussing this conversation about whiskey instead of other spirits? Well, one reason is that whiskey and cider emerged, according to Adrian Rodenbach, as America's most popular drinks. They're both cheap and plentiful when available, produced in the United States from homegrown products. They benefited from national sentiment. What is missing from this is gin. After the American Revolution, drinking gin was considered unpatriotic. You just did not drink gin. It'll reemerge during Prohibition for reasons I'll explain later, but whiskey and cider were the drinks that people wanted. And also, whiskey and cider contained more alcohol than beer did. Colonial, when they drank wine, they wanted it fortified. Jefferson was known for drinking Madeira, for example, and there was I'd say around 20% ABV. And now how much did they drink? From 1790 to 1830, spirits consumption in the United States nearly doubled, from 5 to 9 and a half gallons per person annually. Per person. This means men, women, and children, knowing that men typically drink a bit more than women, and children drink much less than either of them. This was a lot of alcohol. I mean, people are just going, Tocqueville would come over and visit us and go, oh my God. It was just mind-blowing how incredibly intoxicated we were. But if you're drinking in public, you were a man. Women did not drink in public. They would drink at home. And they were also the ones who were the ones doing the distilling at home. So women were the first craft distillers in the United States. This continued, a lot of it with a European tradition, but it was pretty much done by the women. Now, how did this affect us going westward? See, a taste for spirits was a result of this great push westward. And one reason with problem with beer is that transport. A barrel of beer is a heavy thing when compared to a barrel of spirits. It doesn't contain as much alcohol. If you're a settler heading west into the great unknown with limited space and weight in your wagon, a barrel of whiskey will get you a lot drunker and a lot farther. So basically, any trapper, prospector, or horse trader who alighted on the lands wild and unknown was almost certain to have some whiskey on his person for the dual purpose of consumption and commerce. And the commerce here is a very important thing. Once you went west of the Mississippi, there was no money. There was nothing for you to exchange. So whiskey became a very valuable commodity that you could use to trade for the variety of things that you'd need. And also, so this is when the first whiskey began to arrive. This is a picture that Mark Twain did in his book, Life of the Mississippi, you'll see whiskey came to the forefront. And here is how Mark Twain describes it, as only Mark Twain can describe things. How solemn and beautiful is the thought that the earliest pioneer of civilization, the van leader of civilization, is never the steamboat, never the railroad, never the newspaper, never the Sabbath school, never the missionary, but always whiskey. Such is the case. Look history over. You'll see. The missionary comes after the whiskey. I mean, he arrives after the whiskey's arrived. Next comes the poor immigrant with axe and hoe and rifle. Next, the trader. Next, the miscellaneous rush. Next, the gambler, the desperado, the highwayman, and all their kindred kin of both sexes. And next, the smart chap who has bought away up an old grant that covers all the land. This brings the lawyer tribe. The vigilante committee brings the undertaker. All these interests bring the newspaper. The newspaper starts up politics and a railroad. All hands turn and build a church and a jail. Behold, civilization is established forever in the land. But whiskey, you see, was the van leader in this benevolent work. It always is. It was like a foreigner, inexcusable in a foreigner to be ignorant of this great truth and wander off into astronomy to borrow a symbol. But if he had been conversant with the facts, he would have said, westward the jug of empire takes its way. Now, the lore of the Pacific Northwest, we all know it starts with Lewis and Clark. But the one thing that the history books forgot to bring out was the fact that the 6 kegs of whiskey they brought on their journey, nor do they elaborate on the struggles they had when they ran out of it at the Great Falls and how the journey that followed proved challenging without it. But these were not our first travelers who hit the West. That distinction belonged to the fur traders. They lived and hunted alone together for 11 months. They would be thrown together with the money, whiskey, and tobacco they received for the furs they trapped during the year. There was little stable currency west of the Mississippi. So over time, this rendezvous, they would get together, the eastern fur traders, like the Astors and whatnot, be arranging these gatherings to kind of collect all the money. It became into a big Rocky Mountain gathering, combining aspects of a carnival, a souk, a showdown, and a rodeo. And the climax would be when the whiskey kegs would be debunked and they would make it into a giant tent. And I was trying to look for a photo of a tent. I could not find one in the U.S., but I did find this one in the Yukon Territory. This gives you an idea of what it exactly looked like. It was not much to see, but the first thing you would do, and as soon as you established anywhere, this would be established first. So before you established anything else, the first thing they would do was set up the saloon. Now, many of the settlers came from a variety of European backgrounds, such as German, Scottish, and Irish. They had these great legacies of distilling fruit brandies and grain spirits. In theory, the frontier was an ideal place for distilling whiskey. There's all this water, ample fields for growing grain, and bountiful woods to heat the stills. However, whiskey takes time to mature if you want to drink something that's actually decent and drinkable. And there was just absolutely no way the frontier farms could begin to produce the quantities of whiskey. There was no stagecoach, there was no railroad, so you had to make do with whatever you had at this given moment. And that's why the first whiskey that we saw hitting the frontier was called rot gut. And it was called that because of what it does to your internal organs. And bear in mind, as you go through this, until Oregon became a state in 1859, and then Washington was in 1899, enforcing any law was pointless. In fact, the only laws they would try to enforce were against the native peoples, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but there was pretty much, how are you going to enforce it? Who's going to enforce it? The answer is nobody. So to describe the kind of whiskey that they were drinking, here's some tasting notes. From a frontier traveler named Irvin S. Cobb, corn liquor smells like gangrene starting in a mildew silo. It tastes like the wrath to come, and when you absorb a deep swig of it, you have all the sensations of having swallowed a lighted kerosene lamp. And I actually found someone came up with what they thought was a version of a recipe for this. Here's some of the nicknames that you call it. Bug juice, chain lightning, coffin varnish, mountain horitzer, skull varnish, snake water, tanglefoot, and tarantula juice. Not names of a product you would really want to have anything to do with. And here's the recipe. You get a gallon of alcohol, a plug of black twisted tobacco for color, a pound of blackstrap molasses for flavor, a handful of red Spanish pepper for spice, 5 gallons river water. Optional add-ins, 2 rattlesnake heads per barrel to give it spirit. That was more in the West than the Pacific Northwest. Wormwood, castoreum, and I had to look this one up because I didn't know what it was. I discovered it's a substance produced near a beaver's anus to mark their territory. It's now recognized by the FDA as a safe food additive. Just like you can drink, just like whale vomit, and the other one was gunpowder. Now, this is an urban legend. They say that one way you could test your whiskey is if it was 100% proof, it would light on fire. And this group of people called this Three Drinkers podcast, a bunch of people like to get drunk and do silly things. On their podcast, they actually tested this, and it works. And the final one was strychnine. That was something that was sold to the natives to keep them subdued. This is one of these absolutely horrible truths. I'm hoping that as more and more research, it's very scant research as to how the whiskey impacted the native tribes. I hope that more people will continue to do this research. It was very hard to find what little I could find. There is one book called Murder in the Mission by Blaine Harden. If you want to start reading, he debunks the Marcus Whitman myth by saying that the natives were not massacred because they were being horrible, but it was actually a case of self-defense. And also, with the purchase of the Alaska Territory in 1867, soldiers they were dispatched to the Outway Alaska wilderness. There was no easy alcohol to access. So what they would make was this thing called hushino. You would use molasses, yeast, berries, sugar, graham flour. It was also known as Blue Ruin in Oregon. Now you look at these ingredients, you think, this isn't going to be dangerous. But what they leave out from this is because they're so limited substance, there was no cuts made. Now, legally, you do a cut because if you don't do a cut, you're going to have too much methanol in it, and it could kill you. Nothing was cut. This stuff was loaded with methanol as it was being made. And this is where we get the name hooch from, because it's used to describe any inferior distilled spirit that's absolutely garbage. Other names you would use to describe illicit spirits is moonshine. It's called that because you would try to distill it under the light of the moon because you didn't want to use any light, you didn't want to be detected, you were trying to avoid it. Mountain Dew and Catadaddy. Now, the first instance of actual distilling in Washington State occurred in 1833. The Hudson Bay Company constructed a distillery in the village of Vancouver. It's where they have Fort Vancouver now. The actual remains of the distillery, we've never been able to find it, but they did find these, a barrel and tap keg, spigot, and copper tube. We don't know if these were used at the distillery or if they were used at the home. They did find a lot of bottles when they were doing the reconstruction at Fort Vancouver, a lot. So it's obvious there was a lot of drinking going on. There's rumors they had the first wine grapes were planted there in 1825. However, to call this a vineyard is a stretch. It was more like a trellis and like a little bit something for someone's home use. Now, after 3 years, they ceased operations of this, and the reason for that is that there had been a practice going. If you can give the natives, if you gave them liquor, they would do the fur trading for you. Fur trading was incredibly dangerous, it's just one of those things, very deadly, and they discovered pretty quickly that if you gave someone enough booze, they could give you the furs, and you didn't have to do the hard work. But the local tribe said, please, just stop giving him the liquor. And they finally agreed because they needed the fur trade badly enough. They said, we're just going to exchange something else for this because we didn't want to lose the fur trade. But soon after this, missionaries just kept coming. However, the infrastructure didn't fall enough. There were no roads, no railways, no courthouses, no bars. This is where I said the tent saloon would be set up. It would suffice as the local drinking hole. Now, these were especially popular in the local mining camps, where the saloon would function as a poor man's club and a community social center. Now, those with means would be drinking at home. They would be able to bring their, liquor that they got from Europe usually, but this was for people. It was not a good place to be. And you'll see this is one of the early saloons he found in Lowell in 1891, which is south of Everett. There was no restrictions on the vending of liquor. Whiskey was the favorite drink, often taken as a gulp. Drunkards and children were served. It was not uncommon for the dad to send the kid down with a bucket to go into the saloon. He would go into the saloon, and basically it was kind of like going into an NC-17 movie. There was, prostitution going on. There was drinking, gambling. It was also used as a local post office. No women would go into this place unless they were a sex worker or they were possibly the saloon owner's wife. It was just not, if you were a woman, you would not want to go into that at all. And here's another one. This is one in Everett, which is a little bit more upscale, you might say. Now, to give you a sense of the saloon culture in the 1890s, Everett had a population of less than 30,000, but 40 saloons. By 1909, Little South Washington's town of Pasco, population of 2,000, was home to 66 drinking establishments. Now, for a more urban vibe, this is what First Avenue looked like in 1914. This is First Avenue Saloon. You see there's a side entrance. That's where, that little door, that's where a woman could enter, but no woman would dare go through that. Every now and then, this is in Port Angeles, it might be slightly more upscale, as in this paragraph. But when we look at this, it looks kind of nice and romantic-y. And we're saying that we should not be misled by the false historical narrative and think this is, comparing these saloons with the well-regulated taverns and restaurants of today. Unlike the fictional bar featured in the TV show Cheers, the saloon keeper wasn't your friend. He aimed to get as much of your money as possible through undermeasuring or watering down your drinks, running up your tab, or enticing you with his gaming table and prostitutes. He'd use his clout and fist to intimidate those who disagree with him and give some of his ill-gotten gains to corrupt politicians to look the other way. Now, saloons, they were aided and abetted by the big breweries. They paid for most or all of the saloon's furnishings, along with the cutlery, the glassware, and the food. And often they would give us free lunch. This would really anger the local restaurants, who got very annoyed because the customers, they would give them salty fare they served, knowing it would encourage them to buy more alcohol. And this is where you get the phrase, there's no such thing as a free lunch, comes from. And this was an example of some of the first examples of actual distilling. A number of bars would start to make their own spirits. This was produced by the Bohemian Liquor Company in 1911. They went the additional length of actually getting a license to produce this. And most of the people were not getting a license. They just kind of did what they wanted to do. Now, there were some lies. This was getting so bad, they tried to do several laws to try to change this. The Bottle and Bond Act in 1897, it created a certification for unadulterated whiskey. So if you bought something that's bottled and bond, it was sealed, you knew that it was going to be safe, you knew it could be consumed well, and you wouldn't get ill or die. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 prohibited adulterated or mishandled or poisonous or deleterious liquors, food, drugs, and medicine. And the Taft decision in 1909 created definitions for bourbon and other whiskeys produced in the United States. Because a lot of stuff they said was whiskey was not whiskey. It wasn't even have grain in it. Now, we're getting into the times. In 1910, women got the right to vote. And one of the first things they did was they began to pass laws banning the use of alcohol. In 1912, 42% of Washington went dry, including Bellingham, 6 counties, along with 28 rural areas and cities and towns. January 1916, Washington went nearly dry, and then we had national prohibition from January 17, 1920 to December 5th, 1933. And here I think one of the issues they've kind of gotten into, there's been a huge debate saying it was the anti-liquor forces and the liquor, and it was not nearly that black and white. A lot of the women who were protesting and people were protesting the saloon. They didn't really want to ban all alcohol. They wanted to ban the saloon culture. If you think about it, the saloon culture was basically ripping families to shreds, to put it mildly. Men were drinking day, morning, noon, night, 24/7. The saloon was never closed. And when they look at Carrie Nation, they call her a crazy lady for going and hacking up axes. She actually went even going at 8 in the morning and chasing people out of the bar. So this was not, and also the women, the kids were going hungry. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union wasn't just against alcohol. They were trying to preserve families. So I think we have to look. You're starting to find some feminist writings coming along that's changing some of this focus and getting a different perspective on what the role of women during Prohibition. It wasn't just we hate booze, it's we want to preserve our families. Now during Prohibition, you still could get your liquors a few ways legally. One of the most common ones was if you got a prescription. The number of doctors, even veterinarians, were issuing prescriptions, so you wonder why a dog does not need a shot of Four Roses, but you could get, if you had money, this was not cheap to purchase. There was one legal distillery that in Kentucky that was allowed to sell this. This was pretty decent liquor, unless the pharmacist was kind of a jerk and he didn't like you. He still might, there's no guarantee that this was going to be the really good liquor because he didn't really have to do it. The other way you could do it was you could have home brewing and home distilling. Home brewing and home winemaking. They would buy these horrible grapes that were just not very good for grape, but they would travel well. And they would be, I would say shrunken and dried up, and you could buy a brick of them called Vine Glow. You would then be sold with a packet of yeast and told not to mix it together because it might create wine. They also would sell malt the same way, malt and a thing of yeast. Don't mix them together or you might get beer. The third way was sacramental use. That was primarily the Catholic Church and the Jewish for the Manischewitz and whatnot, but that was a very small piece of it. For the most part, but you also, the other thing is if you had your liquor purchased before Prohibition, you could drink it at home. And that's where a lot of wealthy parties were held. A lot of private clubs, I don't know about the Rainier Club, but the Yale Club I know they purchased enough liquor for 10 years. So if you had money, there were some wild parties being held in people's homes because they had the money and they had the space to store a lot of liquor. But here, one reason you don't hear about a lot of the stories, the Pacific Northwest, is kind of hard to find news about what went on during Prohibition. And one reason was that we had no gun battles over turf or massacres like those in Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. Bootleggers in the Puget Sound were approached the trade like entrepreneurs rather than mobsters. The level of civility was on display in March 1922 when a bootleggers convention was held at a Seattle hotel. Utilizing Robert's Rule of Order, more than 100 bootleggers formally established the protocol for their profession and then celebrated together afterward. They were able to do this because Edwin Brown, the mayor of Seattle, did not care. In fact, there's rumors that Mayor Brown may have had a still in in his basement that Roy Olmsted owned. Now, Roy Olmsted was a gentleman bootlegger. To give you an idea of how established he was, his office is on display at Smith Tower in Seattle. Now think about this. Smith Tower, when first time I toured this, I missed this bit. But when I toured it again, this was the premier office. This is like having a bootlegger in the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building. This was the premier building. He's there. His engineer has an office. His wife has an office. His lawyer has an office. And it's full, nobody cared. To give you an idea, and it's also one Prohibition story I didn't see, which I thought was interesting, was the role that pilots played in this. Now think about this air traffic. The Charles Lindbergh's flight was in 1927. This is a plane from J.R. Scott. He was made chief of the air patrol in the city of Everett. This is the same type of plane that Lindbergh used to fly across the Atlantic. Now, in addition to his law duties, he would occasionally go up to Canada and smuggle spirits. He would fly into Everett. He would halt midfield. He would just drive the booze down the cars down 99 and back into Seattle. There were other pilots I discovered that smuggled things. There was Glenn Holt. He was arrested on Lake Champlain Bay in Lake Washington in 1925. There was also they were also in Tacoma and Olympia. There were other incidents in Spokane. Because you think of this, there was no regulation for the air. You would just fly down, boop, do your dispo. If you happen to see the officer there, you just didn't drop. You just go fly somewhere else. It wasn't that hard to find people who, if you just gave a case of something, they would definitely cover for you. Now, where the name Boeing here comes into play We don't know about his connections to, other than the fact he did testify at Roy Olmsted's trial that he was a client. But Boeing, it makes no sense, they were selling World War I military-grade equipment, including airplane parts. So Al Hubbard, Roy Olmsted's engineer, bought these, put them in his speedboats, and he could outrun the Coast Guard. So that was one of the exact areas. Now, if you got fined, nobody really wanted to fine you. I mean, even Roy Olmsted was only fined $8,000 and spent 4 years in jail, and he was the largest bootlegger in Washington State. If you got caught, nobody really cared. But every now and then they would do a performative raid. Here's an example of one that I found at Port Angeles in 1923. Now, the spirits that they were confiscating would be more like Huccino or Blue Ruin, because whiskey, when you're distilling whiskey, it makes a smoke. You need to have a smoke, you need to have a fire, you can be detected. But for sugar or molasses, you can distill it at room temperature. So often when they were distilling a spirit, it wasn't really pure grain whiskey. That's a little too dangerous. But if you do, and also because the whiskey, it does make a smell, cow farms are considered a very popular area to run your distillery because, nobody can, the cow smelled so bad that whatever you were distilling did not. Now, another thing that was very interesting is the government did say, because we still needed alcohol for industrial use, they would make denatured alcohol. This is what was in industrial-grade alcohol that was used for cleaning products and other products, commercial uses. However, and even though 3 ordinary drinks of this may cause blindness, moonshiners looking to use their maximized product would use this in their distilling. They also would use anything that had alcohol, aftershave lotion, cologne, hair tonic, mouthwash, shellac. Antifreeze was very particular because the rust would give the nice solid body to the product and a mouthfeel. And again, no cuts whatsoever. You're distilling something that's illegal. You're not going to try to maximize product. And who's going to report you? You can't go to the police and say, so-and-so made me sick because then you're going to get arrested for buying. And this is one of the secrets we don't really talk about a whole lot during Prohibition. They talk about they don't discuss the exact product. It's because people know about speakeasies and bootleggers. They aren't familiar with the names. They know Capone and Kennedy. They may have a general impression of casual lie-breaking in wild times kindled by spirits that were supposed to be so readily available. But they do not know about yak yak bourbon, jackass brandy, and squirrel whiskey. They do not know about cooking alcohol squeezed through a rag and mothballs dropped into a steaming pile of gasoline. And do not know about Jamaican gin and the men who drank it in doses that were so much more than minute, thereby getting rid of their thirst for a few minutes as they turn into cripples for the rest of their lives. Now, one of the things, this is an interesting case, is that this also marked the first time that I was seeing women as bootleggers. This is Mary Draghi, her brother Louis and Susie on the family farm count. She was also the repeated queen of the foothill bootleggers in Black Diamond, which is way up north near Canada. When the police raided her place with her father, they found 15,000 bottles of beer, 400 gallons of home brew, 800 gallons of wine, and a quantity of moonshine. They found 4 different drinking places set up kind of similar to France. And as they were destroying one, people started dumping out from the other 4. So this was a pretty big raid. And I also found that these were the Seattle Dry Squad. These were the people in charge of enforcing the law. And one of the things they busted was the largest moonshine still captured in Seattle. It was in 1924, belonged to another young woman, Mrs. Teresa Jones. She was 28. The actual size of her still we don't know about, but when they raided her house, they found the house was completely equipped for a first-class distillery. She was dressed. She was going out to a party. She just took off her hat, told the policeman where they were. She was fined $500, went on to her party. Now, lost in the tail of this were people like this. This is the Nesset family, and their friends shipping moonshine. The Nessets were a very religious family. They were very devout, but they were also broke. And so they began to make whiskey. And these were people of a very dedicated farmers. I would say this was a very quality craft product. Every now and then you would find a farmer who really cared about their craft, really wanted to make something. And here they are with some of their families are distilling. Now, after this became kind of a joke. It was just absolutely, nothing was working. Eventually, they said, we have got to go from just, this is an experiment that failed. We're going to have to end this, but we need to find a way to try to legislate it. So the Washington State Liquor Control Board came about, and here they wanted to set up a 3-tier system. So a system of checks and balances that determined, so you'd be like, you could distill it, you could sell it, or you could sell the bottle, or you could serve it. And here's where this is an example of a state liquor store. It's the earliest photo I could find. They were very dreary places that really, it was kind of like going into like the post office from hell. They were just, I mean, you couldn't even see what you wanted. You just go behind there, just buy something. We did have a distillery that opened, believe it or not, in 1934. It would sell mellow, smooth, dry gin and mellow, more and straight bourbon. The slogan's Buy Washington, Union Made, Washington Made. Closed after 4 years. We do not know why it closed, because the Washington State Liquor Control Board lost all of their records for this one. But Washington State, the Liquor Control Board, was distilling Scotch. There was a huge demand for Scotch. They decided to buy a bunch of a bulk of it, and they were selling it here for a while. That closed in 1967 when the liquor was getting so inexpensive that it was just, they weren't going to make any money from it. Other people were able to undersell them. Now, initially, bars and taverns could only sell beer and wine. It led some establishments to sidestep the new law by allowing guests to smuggle in bottles of liquor, at which point they became known as bottle clubs. You could not sell liquor that did not become legal until 1949. And blue laws were on the books till 1966, and that's one good reason why Ballard and Georgetown did not want to join Seattle, because you have these workers working their asses off, and they're like, oh, suddenly I'm going to drink. Well, no, you can't. Well, then I'm not going to join Seattle. Forget that. And eventually they began to relax the laws forbidding people to drink while standing or women from sitting on bar stools. And the reason for that was they thought if a woman was sitting on a bar stool, she was looking to solicit for sex, which is kind of ridiculous. And eventually they began to allow the sale of beer at sports arenas, liquor advertising on buses and Sundays, and on daytime television. Now, there was no craft distillery here, though. No distillery until Dry Fly opened in 2007. They then spearheaded some legislation in 2008 that allowed for the number of distilleries in Washington to grow from 1 to over 20. Right now, I'm estimating the number is approximately 75. I say approximate because sometimes people get a license and then they open and they kind of don't really open. Sometimes a bartender wants a license and he decides, I'm not going to do it. We have a lot of licenses were issued in 2019, which the person that post-COVID said, forget it, I'm not going to even try this. So the exact number is a little bit murky. Now here's an example of one distiller who continues on with his family tradition. This is the Wolfert's Distilling. The family owned a very successful bakery business. And during Prohibition, they decided to turn the baking business into making whiskey because the fermenting yeast and sugar sounded very similar to alcohol. They even were able to even there was the family home, the third-story home, blew up as a result of a still. And they just said, oops, it's a gas leak or something. So this is one of the most exciting things I'm excited about here is that we have the evolution of Pacific Northwest single malt. The first person was Steve McCarthy at Clear Creek Distillery, now owned by Hood River Distillers, who made the first American single malt in 1990s. This is Westland Distillery. They're the second distillery in the United States dedicated exclusively to American single malt. And here is a good example at Copperworks. He was the head brewer at Pike. He's now the co-founder of Copperworks. And this points to something you find in the Pacific Northwest and not a lot of other places. Here, people brew their wort, so it's more flavorful. They're also looking at having specialty grains. So instead of making, most places make their whiskeys so everything tastes the same. It's called the yield. They're looking for the same taste, the same thing. Here it's flavor over yield. So you're often finding people doing a lot of experimentation, a lot of interesting craft experiments here. Now, the specific Northwest whiskeys, they speak to the terroir of a particular region, as well as the distiller's unique style. The idea of the flavor of a beverage is somewhat determined by the place where it was made in the land where raw materials have grown. And in this way, I'm finding the whole conversation about whiskey is very similar to wine. People start to have a conversation like, where's the AVA? People are asking, where is the whiskey coming from? Where is the farmer going? Is it grown with salmon safe? Is it grown with this? Kind of different environmental initiatives. It's becoming a very exciting region. And the factors are bearing, like climate, weather, season, topography, proximity. I mean, these are all the same kind of conversations that we have these conversations in the Pacific Northwest, and you don't hear them elsewhere. It's a very unique thing we have to be really proud of. And this is the day that American single malt became a category. And just here's a couple of my favorite single malts. The one to the far left, that is Talking Cedar. That is down in Ground Mound. That's the first distillery built on tribal lands in the United States. Due to changes in laws, they could not do this until 2018, which gives you an idea of how antiquated the laws were. That's Westward. They've been winning the best whiskey. Sorry, Westland. Westland has won the top 20 whiskeys 2 years in a row. They've been in the top 20. Copperworks is really leading the nation as far as just some incredibly mixtures of grain and whatnot. Scratch Distillery is owned by a woman. Incredible stuff. And Highside is I would say Copperworks baby. They've been doing a lot of work together here. And this is a very interesting this is a project that Bainbridge Organic did with their whiskeys. They were discovering that there was a group of people from Japanese origin who were in Bainbridge Island who were forced to leave. And it was very horrible. It's a very tragic story. And a way to kind of regain that history and raise money to bring the project back, he started launching this whiskey project here. And we have this Northwest Whiskey Trail, which is now starting in Portland and goes all the way up to Canada. We have several people here coming up this. And this trail also points to some of the challenges of being the whiskey. Since this is the latest map, but originally there were 2 more distilleries in Canada that had to close. And right now I just got word that from Portland that Westward is now in bankruptcy, and they're trying to restructure. So there's a lot of struggles in trying to, in a post-COVID era, continue to go along with this. But despite all that, I still remain optimistic. There's a lot of really exciting things happening, and not just in whiskey. The Pacific Northwest is leading in the production of aquavit. We have a number of Scandinavian countries. I did a piece on, it's a very specialty spirit, but I found 7 distillers in the Pacific Northwest that make aquavit, which is kind of interesting. You're finding Wild Ridge Vineyard and Distillery led the state in trying to say that he wanted to distill his grapes. So instead of making it into must and just using for compost or whatever, you're finding people now wanting to combine wineries with distilling licenses. You're finding breweries that are having distilling licenses. It's becoming a very exciting area here. A number of distillers are experimenting with their botanicals, especially with some of the gins. I mean, and so this is not the bathtub gin they used in Prohibition, where the botanicals were used to mask some really horrible stuff that could kill you, but just incredibly taking advantage of what is the Pacific Northwest has to offer. And what I think is this is getting me very excited just to see where all this is going to be going, and I'm happy to answer if anybody has any questions about any of this. Yeah.
When you refer to distillery, is that specifically places that are distilling spirits, or is that also including breweries, places that are just doing beers or cider?
When I say distilling, it's people that have a distilling license. And this is one thing that's getting kind of interesting, because a number of places will call themselves a distillery, but they're not actually distilling something. They're blending something together. They're putting it together. And it can be perfectly fine. I mean, I think blending is an art unto itself. It is a beautiful, it is to be able to take several different products and put it together in a beautiful finish. But that's a blender. I'd love to see blenders getting the same recognition that a distiller gets, because I think that sometimes people go blending. No, blending can be beautiful. It's absolutely, but to say something is distilled by, it means it is distilled in that place.
Could you ask that question one more time for folks online to hear it? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. That question was, when you're referring to the word distillery, are you referring to people who distill like liquor, or people also who are brewing?
Okay. A couple times I've had a product from the Cady Distillery, CADEE, and they were wonderful. But when I've looked at them online to see if I could visit or something, it looks like they're always closed, or I never know
they're
what.
out of operation.
Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah.
That was tasty. Okay.
I just have a couple comments. My wife and I took a tour of the Smith Tower, and you mentioned the couple, and the woman would have like a children's bedtime story, and within the story, on the radio, they had a radio there at the Smith Tower, and the story would incorporate information of where the Coast Guard was, in code in the story, so the bootleggers would know where the Coast Guard was.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you mentioned the boats, outrunning the Coast Guard, that kind of thing, and I think that maybe led to this area, Puget Sound being, the success they had with the hydroplanes.
It might have been, but what was interesting about when you look at the whole Puget Sound area, and you look at it, it was just very rocky. I mean, these guys would go at night. These guys, you would have to be crazy to want to go in the waters. And so one of the advantages they had is that the Coast Guard was like, you're not paying me enough money to do this. This is dangerous. And you also had another gentleman named Johnny Sharp. I didn't mention because I was discussing distilling. But he was so fast that there was a $25,000 reward if anybody could catch him. Nobody could catch him. And in fact, one of the things they did is that we were getting our stuff from Canada, and Canada finally got wise and said, look, you just can't. They're putting the laws in. So what the Consolidated Importers did, which is the major distributor, they took this big, huge boat, they put it out in international waters, and then people would go to international waters, and Canada couldn't interfere because it was international waters. And in doing that, Johnny Sharp then said, well, my boat can't do this. But Johnny Sharp was so successful, the Consolidated Importers bought him a bigger boat so he could then do the importing. I mean, the stories that you hear are just absolutely bonkers about
One other thing, so my wife and I vacationed for several years on the Strait of Juan de Fuca in Joyce, Washington, which is 25 miles west of Port Angeles, and so where we stayed was Whiskey Creek Beach, and there's a Whiskey Creek, and that's where people picked up the locals picked up the whiskey from the bootleggers.
There's even rumors, because I think Boeing lived in this place called the Highlands, and basically down at the bottom of the Highlands was a major smuggling area, and this is where the Nordstroms, the Boeings. I mean, it's never been proven, but there's pretty strong suspicion that these shipments were being funneled up to these people. But you can't. Nobody has any records of any of this. Certain things you don't want to record in history, and this is definitely one of them.
It looks like we have an online question.
Yes, we do. Somebody is asking, what are the requirements to be added to the Pacific Northwest Whiskey Trail? They mentioned that they didn't see Heritage and Woodinville distilleries on there.
One of the requirements is that you needed to produce a single grain whiskey. And people can apply if they want to be. I don't know. I don't think Heritage makes a single grain whiskey that would fit. They're also looking primarily at the west area, the upper. I mean, anybody can apply if they want to apply. It was basically a marketing thing. Like, we have all these whiskey trails up and down the coast. Let's get this trail started. It's only been around for a few years, so it's still a very new invention. And as I said, it is a challenge because already 2 Canadian distilleries aren't there anymore. I think Westward is going to probably find another buyer, but right now they're under restructuring. I mean, this is a very difficult time, I think, right now for distillers post-COVID. People are not drinking as much as they used to drink during COVID. And some people expanded in hopes that people would be drinking a bit more than they, and all of a sudden they're like, what do we do with this?
Okay, so now we have a population, a culture that is bringing variety into the whiskey product. What qualifies this to be a whiskey? Is there like a quality, a list of certain
The
ingredients?
TTB has very strict restrictions. For example, if you want to say something is a whiskey must be made with a certain percentage of a grain bill, basically. If you want to say it's bourbon, it must be 51% corn. If you want to say that it is wheat, it must be of a certain type of a percentage in order to call it this, but it must be a grain product. For example, John Wolford, he uses his family recipe. He doesn't call it whiskey because it's a sugar shine recipe. It tastes like whiskey. It had a nice taste to it, but it's not whiskey technically. So it has to do, the TTB is very picky. In fact, that's what took forever to get the American single malt category approved, because they said it had to be 100% barley, had to be made by aged for so many years, do this, do that. And then other distillers were like, well, what about our whiskey? We make a certain kind of whiskey. So the TTB is very strict. If you call something a straight bourbon, if you call it a bottled in bond, it's very, the government's pretty strict on what you can and cannot call something.
We have another question online. The Maca Reservation does not allow alcohol. Do you know the policies on other tribal reservations in our state?
No, I do not. I mean, I think for that, I would think the people at Talking Cedar might be able to, if you want to get in touch with them, because they were somehow able to set up a brewery and a restaurant, and then you opened up a distillery. In fact, there's now starting to do another one down in Oregon at the Coquille Tribe in the Mill Casino in Coos Bend. So I do not know how the tribal regulations, I'm not up on that, sorry.
I was speaking to a staff member today, and they had a question because I saw this photo, and they were wondering why whiskey was spelled without the E, and if there's different ways.
In Scotland, it's Y. In everywhere else, just about, it's EY. But in fact, that and one reason why we can't call it Scotch is Scotch has the same issue as champagne. You're not allowed to call anything Scotch that's not made in Scotland. Just like we call it sparkling wine. Or you can call it something else, but you cannot call it champagne legally and sell it. It's trademarked. Does anyone else have any other questions or anything any recommendations or anything you'd like? I mean, because one thing I forgot to mention is for those who want something, a really good treat is right down in the Tumwater Craft District, which is pretty near here. The South Puget Sound Community College has set up the first program in the United States. It's a 2-year associate program for brewing, distilling, and cider making. And they have a tasting room in the Craft District area, and there you can go and sample. So if you want to try to sample some of the latest stuff that people are making, then that's a good place to go for. The reason why this is significant is prior to this, people aren't going to really tell you this, but a lot of people learn their distilling the illegal way. Home distilling is still illegal. You can, with the 1979, after Prohibition, they said home winemaking and home brewing was illegal until Jimmy Carter signed a law in 1979. But home distilling is still illegal. You can buy the equipment for research purposes online, but you cannot distill, and the reason for that is simply you could blow your house up. You could blow up your neighbors. If you misuse it, the worst you're going to do if you make bad beer or bad wine is get yourself sick. But you're not going to blow up your house or blow up your neighbor's house like you could if you had a methanol accident. But this is really great news because what's had to happen is that people would go and they didn't learn from their daddy. And it was usually same over to fishing. The father taught the son. The father didn't teach the woman, didn't teach their daughters how to fish. They didn't teach them how to do distilling. But with this program, they're getting a lot of women coming into this program. This is going to be a great way to train a lot of new people. They don't need a 4-year degree. This is teaching you just how to make this. This isn't like getting the chemistry degree, getting a math degree, but it's a very good way, I think, to hopefully infuse some very good and innovative people into the system.
On the note of that, something you said earlier reminded me of this, and it's just a comment, an exciting one in my opinion. In 2019, Jameson had their first all-female of trainees for their new distillers. Mm-hmm. And because every year with their new distillers, they make a single batch of a specific type of whiskey. Sorry, not whiskey. Yeah, whiskey. And that year was made by a completely all-female trainee staff, and it was the first time it had ever happened.
That's fantastic. Well, I've been hearing from a couple of distillers that they're discussing how women have different olfactory senses and different taste buds than men. And so some way just to get that different perspective in, I think it's going to be really, really exciting and really dynamic. And that's what I'm hoping that this new program, because they're getting about half women, a number of women are enrolling in this. And it's also a lot easier because they don't have to go through a 4-year program of chemistry, which for a lot of people is just not something of interest to them.
You mentioned earlier that there are some aquavit distillers.
Yeah.
Would they be also in the craft
Oh,
district?
There's, I'm just thinking, let's see. Yeah, there a number of them are. Nightside, I know, is one that's a really good one. Scratch makes one. Blackfish Spirits and makes one. I did an article on SIP. If you Google my name, Becky Garrison, SIP, magazine Aquavit, that's where I listed the 7 distillers. Yeah, they're all, in fact, even Woodinville Whiskey, which is the largest distillery in the state, they changed the laws. So for craft whiskey, so normally nationwide it's 75,000, bottles. They changed it to 150, so Woodinville is still considered craft. Though I think they're kind of pushing Woodinville and possibly Westland are the two that might be pushing the limit. At which point you're not considered part of the craft movement. But I would say, and Heritage probably is not considered part of the craft movement. Most of the distilleries here would definitely fall within the craft definition.
And when I've been in Scandinavia, they often talk about aquavit and brandvin, fire wine. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference, or just like anything else, it depends on the blends?
I'm only familiar with the people that I know that are making the aquavit, and I don't know about making the other products. Oh, I forgot another one that's very good is Temple Distilling in Linwood. So there's I think Temple Distilling in Linwood, Nightside Distilling, Blackfish, and Scratch are the 4 that come to mind immediately that make aquavit.
I just had a question about the program. So you said next month is the last history talks for the season? So when you have it every month, which months do you have it?
So we run our History Talk program September through May. So after May, we'll take the summer off, and we will see you all again in September.
And also, for anybody who's interested, I have postcards about the book in the back. I also have some information about the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission and Westland and Copperworks. The Copperworks card has a 10% discount for those who might want to go, and also some pins from Westland and the American Single Malt Whiskey Commission. So they're in the back. Feel free to take them if you'd like.
All right, folks, that will conclude tonight's program. Thank you so much, Becky, for joining us this evening. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks, folks, for watching at home, and we will see you next month.